welcome back to season 3, episode 5 of Winning the Challenger Sale. So today is one I'm really excited about. I'm excited about it for a few reasons. One, to be completely candid with you, this is something I struggled with for a really long time as a salesperson. And two, because if we think about the environment we're all selling into today, I think one of the things we're all probably feeling a little bit of is that uncertainty, that question, are we heading into a recession? What's going to happen? And why I get so excited about the theme of persuasive storytelling is because I will say firsthand, I have seen how powerful storytelling can be to elicit an action, a reaction, a movement in our sales process when uncertainty is surrounding us. So like I said, this is something where I spent a lot of time learning about this. I'm super excited to talk about some of the challenges I faced, what I think makes a difference, and give you some really actionable frameworks and tools as you look to improve your own storytelling skills. So with that all said, it wouldn't be appropriate to start a storytelling webinar without telling a story. So let's do it. Anyone who follows me or is connected with me on LinkedIn, you will recognize this, right? I posted this post yesterday because I knew this was happening today and I wanted to kind of test something. So for anybody that knows me, knows this is my pride, my joy, my terribly behaved dog. He's 10 years old. His name is Muggsy. He has still not found a way to get housebroken. I've kind of given up. In fact, we actually have him in a diaper now, if that's any indication of how much I've given up on the hope of him ever stopping peeing in the house. Now, you'll see the title of this slide is Muggsy, the bath towel, and cost of inaction, or COI. Now, anybody who's joined us before knows just how much I love to talk about cost of inaction. For anyone that's newer, cost of inaction is simply helping your prospect understand why there is a cost or risk associated with staying the same, right? And it's a different take on ROI, which is the return if you change, if you buy, if you do something different. For me personally, it's probably the single most effective thing I've learned as a salesperson that's helped me become better at selling. Now, cost of inaction, while I love it, I'm passionate, I talk about it all the time, is kind of a complex concept to understand, right? It's not something we've traditionally learned in sales. And so I'm constantly thinking about how do I get people to really relate to it, understand it, and remember it. So because I knew we had this coming up today, I posted yesterday a story about Muggsy. Now, for the last year, I have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. We have been trying to get the 7-year-old and 9-year-old to hang up their towels after they shower. But their ritual is this: go take a shower, dry off, bring the towel back to their bedroom, and throw it on the floor. If you're a parent, I'm sure you can relate to this. It is so frustrating. Every time I go in the room and I see that it's happened, what do? I sit down and I talk to them and I say, listen, Lucia, every time you leave this towel on the floor, it's getting stinky. It's not drying as fast. So it's a little bit damp when you use it, and it's getting dirtier faster. And she looks at me and she's like, it's okay. I'm okay if it's a little bit damp. I'm okay if it's got a little stank on it, right? And she's certainly not doing the laundry. So what does she care if it's getting dirtier faster? My argument back to her, or my message back to her, was one of, if you do this, this will be better. It was an ROI message, right? And one, I misread the audience. I didn't land the right points. And two, she just didn't care enough about changing off of status quo. Now, enter my boy Muggsy. I don't typically celebrate Muggsy when he pees in the house, but this was an exception, because what did Muggsy do? Muggsy actually peed on the bath towel in the room. Now, why is that a good thing? Well, there is no better way to actually land a message about the cost of inaction than showing someone what happens when you don't change, right? And Muggsy did it for me. Now, I had to do a little extra laundry yesterday, but I told this story because what this one small experience did is what I couldn't do with my ROI-led messaging, right? I couldn't compel the kids to change because there was no cost to their current behavior. It was just, I'm not realizing better, and they were fine with status quo. And so I told the story on LinkedIn to see what would happen. And sure enough, I had a number of people reach out to me yesterday and said, what a clever way to talk about this concept. I'm going to go use this in my team call when I'm trying to reinforce challenger. I'm going to go tell my team who doesn't really get the cost of inaction this story. And that's what I wanted, right? I want people out there actively talking about these themes, but no matter how many times I use the boring description of what cost of inaction is, I'm not met with a lot of people going out and saying, I'm activated. I'm going to go tell this story now. So why do I tell this? When we think about what we're up against today, right? I talked about the uncertainty. There's all this talk around potentially going into another recession. It's scary. It's ugly. The number one thing we need our prospects, our buyers, our stakeholders to do is act, right? And a few years ago, we did a study to study actually how much, when you've got a willing buyer, when you've got that stakeholder who says, yes, I do want to buy from you, how much are they actually advocating for us? Because let's face it, I don't care what you sell, the days of just selling to a single stakeholder who consults nobody, who checks with nobody, are in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases long gone. And I talk to companies where it's, it could be as few as 2, it could be as many as 40, where you're actually having to get groups of people to buy into change, right? And if you look at what this research taught us, what it taught us is, of all the people that are willing to buy from us, think, hey, I did a first sales interaction, I got them really excited, they want to move forward. What do we need them to do? We need them to go back and get all the other people at that company to feel the same way. But what this is telling us is 51% of those people who want what we have to offer are not willing to advocate for it. Right? So we're going to put up a poll in a second here around why, like, just how much are you seeing this happening inside of your own company, right? How much are you seeing buyers not actually advocate on your behalf? So as you answer, think about this, right? When we are out there actively trying to get advocacy from our stakeholders, here is the story we traditionally tell. Right? This is the story I effectively grew up learning how to tell, which is, here's a company who was struggling to get their reps to enter their activities in CRM. Their forecasts were inaccurate and the VP of sales was super frustrated around it, right? So what did they do? Well, they worked with us. The VP of sales saw a 50% increase in CRM adoption, and our solution helped reduce all the burden on the sellers. And as a result, they got 20% increase in forecast accuracy. And man, did that VP of sales feel like this is the single best thing they bought in 2021. How many of us have told this story? I've told this story 1,000 times, not on this, right? This isn't what I sell, but this is illustrative. How often have we told this story where, if you work with us, here is the beauty that will come? The problem is, when we look at this story, who is the hero here, right? We're the hero. We're the ones that swooped in with the cape and saved the day and fixed the problem. We, the supplier, or our supplier solution. Why is that problematic? Well, anyone who's joined us before, I know you're getting sick of me sharing the slide, but I'm going to keep on sharing it, because we have to remember that we are not the hero of the story, right? The hero of the story is actually our buyer. And why are they the hero? Because they are the ones that are fighting these fights that you see here, right? We talk a lot about how this buying motion is not linear like we'd like it to be, moving left to right. But in reality, when we have an interested stakeholder, they're having to raise their hand in a meeting and ask for budget for something that wasn't anticipated. They're having to convince other people who may have different views of the problem that this is the right problem to solve. They are the one fighting the battles, not us. And so when we think about storytelling, one of the biggest mistakes I used to make was I would always put us as the star of the story, the hero of the story, right? So let's talk about how challengers actually use stories. Now, storytelling is not a concept invented by Challenger. I think we all know that. And storytelling in general is designed to allow someone to feel like they are in the story, to get them to feel an emotional reaction to what we're saying. There's 2 ways that challengers use stories. So one is, I describe this as a motion to create demand, which is in many cases what we're met with, and we talk about this a lot, is status quo buying behaviors, right? Like, I might be interested in what you have to offer, but not enough to take that next step forward. So problem stories, where the story actually doesn't have a happy ending, but rather we are telling the story of what happens when you do nothing, or you stay the same, or you keep solving the problem the way that you have. These are bad ending stories that are designed to allow the stakeholder to see themselves as, shoot, I thought good enough was good enough, and I'm learning that it's not, right? So think of that as problem story. The other type of story is what we would refer to as a solution story. These are the stories with a happy ending. These are the stories where, as a result of behaving differently, good things happen. I would describe this as activating demand. And the reason I describe these two ways is because, as I mentioned before, one of the big missteps I made was I was trying to compel change, trying to compel advocacy by telling the story of what happens if you do something. And I think for many of the pitches that I observe and listen to, and things that we hear and we classically have learned, frankly, growing up in sales, many of us have grown up learning that these solution stories are where we get the best squeeze, right? And so you think about how we structure our storytelling. In many cases, 80% of the stories I'm telling are actually about, look what happened when Mr. or Mrs. Executive did this, and look at the happy ending that we saw. And maybe 20% of the time, candidly, for me, it was probably a lot less. Am I telling a story where the ending is not so good? What we would argue is it's probably flipped on its head, right? Especially, again, I can't reemphasize this enough, in a market like this where uncertainty is as high as it is the classic trap that we fall into, that we think we're going to tell a story of change and people are going to want to get on the bus and they're going to want to ride with us. When in reality, the biggest barrier we face when we're in a recession, when we're in a market where there's a ton of uncertainty, is getting that person to believe that I have to take action, because status quo, the pain of same, is intolerable. So as we get into storytelling today, we're going to talk about problem stories. We're going to talk about solution stories. This is something I want everybody to keep in the back of their mind, is what is my ratio of how much time I am spending pitching change versus using storytelling to deepen the pain. So let's get into it. We are going to refer back to this lovely slide I know many of you have seen before, which is the Challenger choreography. Now, those of you who haven't seen it, this is effectively what we teach to sellers who are adopting the Challenger methodology as a way to structure how you have a conversation with your customers. It's not to say you need to do this in one 30-minute meeting. You can do this over the course of meetings, but essentially the idea is to convey the need to change now, and the need to change with us as a supplier. Now, for those of you that are on us, you're going to see a poll come up to ask you a question about how effective you feel you currently are at doing the emotional impact stage. And the reason I'm asking this is because I'm a big believer in sharing the mistakes I've made and the things I've messed up as a seller. This is how I used to approach the choreography. I'd come in, I would nail the warmer. I would have done discovery. I would say, this is what I understand that the company's trying to achieve. This is how it seems like you're trying to get there. Correct me where I'm wrong. Do a little discovery there. And then I'd land a reframe of a different way of thinking about how they get from A to B. And then I'd start to build a really rational case for change. This is where cost of inaction comes in. And I'm building out, here's the cost of doing nothing. And then my buyer's perking up and they're looking at me saying, okay, that's really interesting. I can see the case for change here. And what would I do? We got our boy Evel Knievel here. I would Evel Knievel right from rational drowning, either into the new way forward or the solution, right? Because I heard what I wanted to hear. I heard the reaction. Yeah, this is really important. This is really, really timely. I need to do this more. I need to do this now. And so what did I do? I ran with it instead of staying true to the choreography. And now, why is that a problem? Because you might think, well, if that's the reaction we want, why not just move faster? We're all trying to get our sales cycles accelerated here. Let's not slow it down. But think again about what we need. If we're in an environment where we are selling to buying groups instead of simply buying individuals, there's Muggsy, what we are met with is we have to activate a response that gets someone to say, I'm going to go in our next budget meeting and throw my hand up and say, we need this, right? That is a huge ask. That is a ton of political risk, or political capital risk. It is a ton of financial risk. We need to really fix that, right? We need to arm someone to want to tell that story. Now, the problem is where my sales would break down is I would go tell a great story, a rational story for the cost of change. But then how hard was that for my stakeholder who in a 30-minute conversation in the midst of 8 other conversations that day has to go and then regurgitate that? That's tough. It's not particularly memorable, right? Because the next call they run on, there's something else that's added to their plate. And this, in my opinion, is where storytelling becomes so tremendously helpful. Because think about what I talked about in the beginning, the story of the cost of an action, how many times I've explained that concept and how many times I've talked about it, and how much it's illuminated and relatable when I tell it through the lens of a story or an analogy. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. When we get into emotional impact, it is all about taking that cost of an action and humanizing it and showing that buyer, here's what happens when we continue to let status quo prevail. So let's break down. We're talking about storytelling. You know, we love frameworks. We know we love tactical things on this episode, on these podcasts and these webinars. I've broken down sort of 3 steps to what I believe are essential to being an effective storyteller. We're going to talk about these 3 steps. They're pretty simple and straightforward. And then we're going to get into how, when, why should I use storytelling in the course of my sales conversations. And I'm going to give you a challenge. Everybody listening, I want someone to accept this challenge, everyone to accept this challenge, to go out and try this with Stuck Opportunities. So first and foremost, let's dig into the steps for effective storytelling. Step number 1, isolate the purpose. This is something I got wrong so often. I was never starting off thinking, what is the emotion, the feeling I want the person on the other end of my story to feel? And as a result, I would tell massively convoluted stories that had moments of excitement, moments of doubt, moments of curiosity, moments of feeling uncertain. And as a result, the buyer, the stakeholder at the other end of the line didn't really know what to do with it, right? So one of the best pieces of advice I got from someone I admire who taught me a lot about storytelling is you, before you even architect the story, need to understand what is the feeling you want to evoke, right? So many times in a first sales interaction, we want to see doubt. We want to see doubt that what I'm currently doing is good enough, especially when we're looking at outbound motions, right? But let's say, for sake of example, you see the first one there. I want the customer to feel urgency. And the reason I want that is because this customer is saying, hey, I'm going to kick this thing out. I don't know how many of you have been seeing deals kick out. I've certainly seen it. But when we hear that, we know that the feeling we need that customer to feel is urgency to solve the problem. So then I think about, how do I create urgency? I need to tell a story of what happens if their competition catches up to them, right? And this is more of a problem story. So I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but something I missed, and I see a lot of people miss, which is, first and foremost, isolate the purpose of the story. What is the emotion you want your customer to feel? Now, next, we can start getting into defining the key elements of the story, and there are 3 of them. So one is the character, the main character of your story. And remember what I talked about. In so few cases do we want, if any cases, do we want the main character of the story to be us and our solution? We always want to make the main character the buyer, the stakeholder. We want them to see themselves in the situation we are teaching. So actually writing it down and defining who is the character of my story sounds super simple, but it keeps us honest and keeps us diligent from slipping into bad behaviors. Number 2, imagery. I will say any great storyteller, whether it's a comedian, whether it's an actress, a writer, a salesperson, you name it, anybody who's effective at storytelling, I think, does a phenomenal job of painting the scene, right? So think about the stories we tell. There's, stories that I tell in the course of my sales pursuits where you are trying to illuminate what it's like for that sales leader who's sitting in a room looking at a forecast that's falling off of a cliff because of what's going in the market, and trying to convey that feeling, right? It requires, frankly, that we understand how our customers feel. It requires that we've spent time putting ourselves in their shoes and imagining, what is it like for my buyer when they have to walk into their boss's office and explain a mistake, a failure, a roadblock, right? So using that imagery. I will say one last thing on this. One of the things I struggled with a lot as well is we're always being mindful now, I think, of our talk time versus listen time. And so this would be the part I'd skip over because I would be so conscious of, hey, I don't want to talk too much. So I'd rush through to get to what happened. And I'd fail to actually really create that imagery that allowed that person to lean in and say, I can see myself, I've been there. So don't rush through that part. And lastly, the initial hook, right? Setting the story up was another thing I always used to view as kind of an afterthought. I'd focus on the body of the story, the meat of the story. What's the thing I want to convey? And I'd fail to think about the first sentence or the first question that I used. And so really good storytellers, you'll notice they'd either use a question, a fact, a quote, a stat, some, 2 or 3 things that don't seemingly go together to create that curiosity for that person to lean in and learn more. So for example, when I did the post yesterday, my first line was, why am I celebrating the fact that Muggsy peed on my kid's towel? Right? It's begging curiosity. It's getting someone to want to lean in and be curious about the story. If you tell them what you're going to tell them up front, not a lot of reason to listen in on the story that you tell. So these are 3 story elements. I literally write these down now so that I can make sure I'm staying true and not slipping into bad behaviors. So that's step 2. Step 3 is structuring our 3-part story arc. This for me was really helpful because it was hard for me to know where I was going with stories and what sort of steps or guideposts I needed to make sure I hit. So you'll see the first step in your 3-part story arc is situation. This is where your main character, your hero, encounters something that leads them to have a moment of reflection or change or transformation. When we fail here, we might as well not even tell the rest of the story, right? When you are describing the situation, we'll go into a little bit more specifics here in a moment, but the thing that we really have to make sure we do is not make assumptions around what we believe or think the situation is like for the star of our story. This is where we want to cull stories from AMs, from interviews with customers, from other customers like them, to really make sure we are telling the story without assumptions or bias around what we think it's like. It's really important that we set up the situation in a way that's accurately reflecting what that stakeholder is potentially going through. Second is the complication. Now, the complication is the tension, the conflict that is exposed, and how that hero maneuvers through that conflict. The important thing I will say here is to make sure we are not making a small complication sound like a bigger thing. I made this mistake a ton when I was selling early in my career. I thought anything that we did was a big problem when sometimes customers perceived it as a small problem. So if you are one of those sellers who has a solution or product or service that you sell that is often undervalued by your customers, think about how you tie it into larger outcomes, larger, costs of an action if they get that wrong. Make sure that complication is not something that's kind of like an itch on your back, but it's a fire they need to put out. And third and finally, the outcome. What happened? Now, remember, when we're telling a problem story, we actually want a bad ending. And I know most of us grew up learning like stories have happy endings, and most of them do. But if we are trying to elicit a customer to realize that status quo is intolerable, we can't tell the happy story. We've got to tell them the story that's probably in the back of their mind that they're trying to ignore and make it believable and realistic so that they see, if I keep going down this path without change, I could end up like the main character in this story. In a solution story, we obviously want it to be a happy ending. And the thing I will say about solution story outcomes is we need to make sure, again, we're not making assumptions or having biases around what we think good outcomes look like for our customers. That's why I can't emphasize enough the importance of doing good discovery so that you're not out there, classic mistake I've made is just assuming everybody wants growth. Candidly, some organizations don't want growth, they want profitability, right? So making sure in your discovery, you are identifying what is the good outcome so that you can map back a story that leads to that outcome. So simple way of thinking about it. But again, this is an easy way to structure your story to make sure you're not rambling on and you hit on all the key points. Now, like we always do, we're going to do a quick do's and don'ts, particularly focusing in on the challenger skills that we teach, right? So I added one in here, preparation, because again, just in the spirit of being honest and vulnerable about things I struggled with, when I would tell stories, I would often just wing it, right? I was never in preparation for a call thinking about what objections might I face or what barriers might I face in trying to get that customer to realize the need to change. And then I'd be in the call trying to think of like, shoot, who have I worked with that had this situation, right? And as a result, my stories weren't that great. Now, how I think about preparation is in addition to all the classic things we do in preparation, looking at the company, looking at what they're trying to achieve, have they done business with us before, all that good stuff. I'm also thinking about what other stories, situations, circumstances like them have we worked with? And candidly, if I was going at this as an N of one, I probably wouldn't have a big bank of stories. One of the things I would encourage to anybody who is a frontline seller, anybody who's a manager, a leader, an enablement leader, is think about building up a bank of problem and solution stories. And you can crowdsource these from inside your own four walls. It is amazing to me when I start spending time with sales organizations, just how many stories are sitting up here and are never documented for others to take advantage of. So if you don't have a bank of stories, problem and solutions separately identified, great thing to take back to your team and encourage to have sort of a crowdsourcing model to do that. The other thing I will say is you don't have to be limited to your own four walls. I've learned tremendous things from listening to podcasts, listening to interviews, listening to, investor presentations about challenges that companies have faced, executives have faced, that have given me great fodders for stories. Second, when it comes to teaching, we talked about this. Don't pull the evil Knievel. Don't do what I did. Make sure that you don't jump to your solution as soon as you get that resonance from your customer, but you're actually telling the story, because the story is the thing that's going to be easy for them to go and tell when you're not in the room. When it comes to tailoring, don't tell the same story to everybody, right? We have to look at this, as we talked about, from our discovery. What is the desired end outcome, or what is the non-desired outcome if we're telling a problem story? And we've got to think about what story is going to be the best story to make them realize what I need them to realize. Last thing, and I'm going to use an example here because I loved this. When we talk about taking control of the buying process, that challenger skill, one of the things we're always met with as sellers, and today is no exception, is objections, right? And I hate the term objection handling or overcoming objections, because I think it's like all about beating the customer. But one great example of this, our VP of sales was working on a deal, and the customer said to him, "Hey, is Challenger just for like super complex sales where your 12-month sales cycle, multi-million-dollar deals?" Now, our VP of sales could have said, "No, it's not, and here's why." Would that have been memorable? Would that have been effective? Hard to say, probably not in my experience. Instead, what he did is he said, "Let me tell you about another customer who had the same exact feeling. Here's the motion in which they sold. Here's the problem they were up against. And here's what was happening by result of them doing nothing," right? And hooked him on the problem story. And then and only then did he switch to a solution story and say, "Now here's what happens now as a result of us working with him." It was such a fantastic story about how he was able to create a memorable moment. That question never came up again, right? Because he handled that objection in a way where the customer saw them. So in my opinion, objection handling, storytelling go hand in hand. So a few quick do's and don'ts. Now, last thing, when do we use storytelling? I put on the page, this is our sort of tempo model. Those of you that are Challenger clients know this quite well, but these are essentially all the steps we go through in pursuit of making a sale. I've listed out here a few of my favorite use cases for storytelling. So 1, stuck deals, revisiting the problem story that we originally told them, or the original story we should have told them, and sending out an email with the subject line, "Remember our conversation on X." X is not our solution. X is not our company. X is the problem that they have, right? And then in the body of the email, telling a super punchy, quick story, creating curiosity for them to remember, right, this was something I was excited about. Let me get back on the phone. I found this to be a really, really phenomenal way to hook someone back in, as opposed to the, "Hey, can we meet again? Did you get the buying group together?" So on and so forth. It's just reactivating that problem story. Cold outreach, telling a story, right? How many of us grew up learning you win customer meetings by doing solution storytelling? Here's what happens if you buy our solution. Far more effective to tell a quick story in your cold outreach that your customer can see themselves in. And again, here at this point in the process, we're thinking problem storytelling. Overcoming an objection, we already talked about that. growing accounts. We get a lot of folks dialed in that are account managers who are trying to get customers to adopt new products and services, rather than go in and say, great to have our QBR. I want to walk you through, here's all the new services and all the upsides of these things and why I think it'd be useful for you. Going back to problem storytelling, right? Helping illuminate this problem that ultimately leads back to your new product you want to sell them, and creating them to that moment where they're leaning in. And then lastly, demand creation. Those of you that know me well know I'm just maniacal about using social. I think it's one of the best gifts that we as salespeople have today to build and create demand. But don't do all this great work to build stories and then just leave it for one-to-one sales calls, right? When you have great stories, those are moments that you can teach where your customers go to learn problems and get them to think differently about problems. So LinkedIn isn't the only place. I spend a lot of time there because salespeople there, but I've worked with companies who sell to homeowners associations who say, hey, they're super active on Facebook because that's where their homeowners are living, right? And so we can go out and tell these stories there and try to surface interest and needs. It could be on webinars. It could be wherever your customers go to learn, but stories are often the best tools we have to capture interest. So think about it as part of your demand creation story. Now, I mentioned before, I have a challenge for everybody listening. Now, Josh Braun, who, I talk endlessly about, I'm such a fan, has this saying called I do over IQ. The fact that everybody dialed in today is phenomenal, right? You are taking a step forward in your learning journey to try to improve your own storytelling skills. And I hope you've learned a few things. But the worst possible thing we can do is hang up from this and do nothing. So my challenge to you, my ask to you, is to take these 4 steps. 1, pick an opportunity that's stuck in your pipeline. If you don't have any, please let me know because I need to know what you're doing differently. I think we're all encountering stuck opportunities right now. 2, revisit your cost of inaction. If you failed to create a cost of inaction, that's okay. It happens. You got to build one, right? 3, using that cost of inaction, build your problem story. I think everybody's probably a little bit more effective at solution stories because we've got so much good material and content for that in many cases. Problem stories, it's often up to us as sellers to figure those out. So build your problem story around the cost of inaction using the frameworks we talked about, and go tell that story to your customer, right? If you need to get them on the phone, like I said, that remember our discussion on X problem, really effective way for me personally to get them on the phone to do it, but tell that story, but then don't stop there because you at this point have put a lot of work into this. The worst possible thing you can do is then retire that and move on to the next one. Instead, look at all the pipeline opportunities you have, look at target opportunities you want, and think about who else is starring in this show. Who else can I go tell this story to? That's how you get scale. That's how you get great impact. And candidly, the more you tell the same story to the right people, the more you get feedback, the more you get additions, the more your prospects are leaning and saying, yeah, and then this happened, right? And that's what we want. We continue to make our stories better, stronger, more relatable. So I do over IQ. Would love it if everyone took the time to do this. And please, this is not like a fake thing. If you do this and you learn something good or bad, please share it with me. I love these stories. It's my favorite part of what I do is learning how these things help or don't work or what needs to be changed. Tell me, share back the feedback loop. I'm so curious to hear how it works for you. So last thing, as we always do, stop, start, continue. Stop making yourselves the hero. Stop only telling solution stories, right? We talked about why that's important. Instead, start identifying what is that emotion, that single emotion you want your customers to feel, and start thinking about and being more diligent about identifying who's the character, what is the imagery I need to use, and what is that initial hook instead of just launching into a story that's not well thought out. Use the framework for situation, complication, and outcome. Think about, is it a problem outcome? Is it a solution outcome? And humanize the cost of inaction. Don't do what I did. Don't Evel Knievel over emotional impact. Lastly, continue. You're all here today because in some way, shape, or form, you're either curious about or using Challenger. So by virtue of having a common conversation choreography, the benefit here, and this is especially true for the clients that we have on the call, is everybody's working through the choreography in the same way. So there's no reason why your peers, you can't tap into them to find out how are they creating emotional impact. Leverage your peer set. It's the best possible resource to your advantage that you can have to tell better stories. So that's it for the webinar. I do want to plug the podcast. Now, I get this question. I realized I don't think I ever explained this. You've got the webinar once a month. You're here, you know that. Some of you may know that we've got the podcast. Now, the podcast comes out every Tuesday. And the idea as to why we do both, which is something I get questions about all the time, is the purpose of the webinar is to give you frameworks and tools and to break down a concept and help you understand how challengers implement an idea. The podcast idea is to say, there are so many good people who show up like challengers day in, day out that have really, really smart tactics and additional context around how to approach whatever the monthly topic is. This month, it's persuasive storytelling. And so the point here is not for me to talk about what we do here at Challenger, but on the podcast is actually pick the brains of people we admire, people we respect, people we think could do this really well in their sleep. And so what you're going to see is we're 2 weeks in. So we've got Ravi Rajani, amazing episode. If you don't know Ravi, he's an incredible person, absolute helper. He breaks down his actual framework for thinking about storytelling and how he approaches it, prepares for it. We've got Brent Adamson. This came out a couple of days ago. If you don't know Brent Adamson, his name's on the Challenger Sale book. He is arguably one of the best sales storytellers out there. He recorded a session with us to talk about how he approaches storytelling, and of course, disrupted all sorts of things that we've held as conventional wisdom. And then next week, we've got Nick Capozzi from DemoStack, who is literally on the road right now, telling stories to all sorts of different potential customers and prospects. And then for those Challenger clients, Doug Ferreira, who is one of our amazing facilitators who everybody loves. He's memorable. He just tells stories in his sleep. And so these are 4 different ways of gathering additional perspective about storytelling. So new episodes each week, wherever you listen to your podcasts, there you go. Now, next month's topic, we are talking all about turning interest into advocacy. Hard word for me to say. This we scratched the surface on. Next time, we're going to be looking at very specific tactics of how do you move from, hey, great call with one person to getting them to bring the buying group. So we're going to talk about all sorts of interesting things there. That's next month, July 14th.